Please go to elithecomputerguy.com in order to view schematics, code, and more for the projects that you are learning about. Welcome back. So in today's video, I'm going to give you a brief overview of VirtualBox in order to be able to do Linux labs in a virtual environment. The nice thing about VirtualBox is this is a piece of virtualization software that allows you to install a full operating system into an instance on your desktop or laptop computer. So you have your desktop or laptop computer and it has Windows or Mac or Linux or whatever else. You install VirtualBox onto that as just a normal piece of software, and then within that, you can create instances of other operating systems. So these are full-fledged installations of these operating systems, and you're able to interact with them as if they are normal computers. So you can change network configurations, you can change configuration files. If you're dealing with Windows Server, something like that, you can set up full Active Directory infrastructure. Basically, these are full-fledged servers or computers. They're simply virtual instances sitting within a VirtualBox. Now, the reason that we're going to be using VirtualBox is because it is open source and free for everything. Again, whenever we talk about open source, one of the big important things is make sure you know what the hell you're talking about. So the nice part with VirtualBox is it is open source and it is free for enterprise use, educational use, any kind of use out there. The other thing that I like about it is that it runs on basically all the operating systems that you folks will be using. So it runs on Windows, it runs on Mac, which was what I'll be using it on. It runs on Linux, and if anybody out there is still using it, it even runs on Solaris. So yeah, you couple of people out there that feel left out because you're running Solaris machines, hey, you can run our VirtualBox too. So that's a nice part about it. Anybody can go out there and use it. You can just download it, install it, and away you can go. Again, even in the enterprise environment. So if you set something up and you really like it and you don't want to have to go over to a different product, you can just continue to use VirtualBox. So those are some of the things that I like. One of the things that you have to be thinking about if you're going to be using VirtualBox is make sure you have a machine with decent resources. So decent hardware. I would argue at least 8 gigs of RAM. I would argue a solid state drive. I would argue a relatively fast processor. The reason being is, remember, right, we are going to have operating systems on an operating system. So now what's going to happen is you're going to have your host operating system, Windows, Linux, Mac, whatever else. It's going to require RAM, it's going to require a hard drive, it's going to require CPU cycles. Then we are going to spin up, basically we're going to turn on instances of operating systems, and now those instances of operating systems will require RAM, will require hard drive, will require CPU. So just kind of keep this in mind. Again, I would say, you know, that 8 gigs of RAM, a solid state drive, that's a good minimum. Theoretically, you could do less. I don't know, maybe you could do 6 gigs of RAM and a 5400 RPM drive if you really wanted. Just realize your performance is definitely going to be lacking the worse hardware you have. So just kind of keep this in mind if you're going to be dealing with VirtualBox or really any kind of virtualization software. Remember, the hardware still matters. And so if you do virtualization on crappy hardware, you're gonna get crappy, kind of flaky results. So anyways, let's go over to the computer. I'll show you where you can download VirtualBox from. Then I'll take you through and show you some of the configuration panels and all that to give you an idea of how VirtualBox works and how you will be setting up a VirtualBox for your Linux labs. So here we are at virtualbox.org. So we're going to go to virtualbox.org, and if we want to be able to download and install VirtualBox, we simply click on this big green button. From there, they then come here, we look for the platform packages, and we can download for Windows hosts, we can download for OS X hosts, we can do for Linux distributions, and of course we can do for Solaris if we're using Solaris for whatever reason. Now, again, I'm using a MacBook Pro in order to do these demonstrations, but more or less, everything should be the same. I really don't think there will be any differences. Once you've downloaded this, you then install VirtualBox. It's a very simple installation procedure. I don't see any reason for me to show you how to do it. So you then install it. Once it's installed, then you can open it up. And when you open up VirtualBox, basically this is what you'll be looking at, only for you won't initially see this Ubuntu server. So I've created a virtual machine for Ubuntu server. Over here will be completely blank. Now, when you first open up VirtualBox for the first time, it may ask you to create a virtual machine. So we can just go through the creating a virtual machine process right now. What you do if you're going to create a virtual machine, so if you're going to create an Ubuntu server or whatever else, you go over here to this weird blue starry type button. We click on that for new, and we can start creating a virtual machine. So test for class. So basically, the first thing you do is you name your virtual machine, whatever the hell you're going to name your virtual machine. This is basically for you. To be clear, this is not the host name of the virtual machine. This is what's going to show up over here in the left-hand side. So you can name it whatever weird-ass name you want. Don't worry, you're not going to have to plug that into network naming or anything like that. Past that, we're going to go down here to the machine folder. So where is the virtual machine basically the virtual hard drive going to be stored? All of this is going to be stored in a single file. So where is that file going to be stored? And so it gives a default location. The next thing is then what kind of operating system do we have? So the type of operating system, is it Windows, Linux, Solaris, BSD, whatever else? We of course are using Linux. And then what kind of Linux? You have all these different Linuxes here. And so for us, we'll go down to Ubuntu 64. Now theoretically, you don't have to be specific on this. I suppose you put it in Windows and then install Linux, but it's like all things, the more specific you can be, probably the better. And then from there, all we're going to do is we're going to click on the continue. The next thing that we're going to be looking at is the memory. This is the RAM size. You have to think about how much RAM your host computer has. So my host has 16 gigs of RAM. And then you have to think about how much RAM you want to give to the virtual machine that you're going to be creating. Now, one of the funny things in life is back when this VirtualBox was being created, 1024, so 1 gig of RAM, that's 1024 megs is a gig. 1 gig of RAM was a hell of a lot of RAM back in the day. Back 10 years ago, a gig of RAM was like, wow, a gig of RAM. Here's one of the times though, you don't want to leave it as default. Like seriously, you don't want to leave it as default. So if you're doing Ubuntu server, if you're doing a Linux distribution with no desktop environment, so Ubuntu server, something like that, CentOS, then 1024 might be okay for you. But realize if you're using something with a modern desktop environment, 1024 is not going to work. Literally, your virtual machine is going to crash. Ubuntu requires at least 2 gigs of RAM with the desktop environment. So this is one of those times. Do not leave the default. If you leave the default and you're installing a Linux distribution with a desktop environment, you will run into problems. So minimum is 2 gigs. You can do 2 gigs. I would say if you have the extra, I would go up to 3 gigs. That just gives you a little bit of wiggle room. Do realize you can change this in the future. So most of these configurations that we're setting, you can change this in the future. So you can start at 3 gigs. If 3 gigs ends up being too much, you can set it down to 2 gigs. But I would say do more first, because remember, you're going to have to actually install the operating system into this instance. So I would prefer to have more RAM to begin with and then realize I don't need as much, versus not having enough RAM and then having my installation process crash because there's not enough RAM. So I would put it to like 3 gigs to begin with, and then later I'll show you how you can go back and change that. Then we're going to go to continue. From here, it's asking about the virtual hard disk, the VDI. Do not add a virtual hard disk is an option. I'm not really sure why you would do that. I guess maybe if you're just setting up a placeholder, that's a possibility. Use an existing virtual hard disk. So remember, with these virtual disks like this VDI, this is a file. The great thing about virtualization is that you can literally take the entire virtual computer, copy it to a USB flash drive, and just move it somewhere else. So let's say I was doing that. Let's say I created a virtual machine here. I was doing all the experimentation. I was playing. I set everything up. I got exactly where I wanted. Then I could copy it to a flash drive, take it to wherever I want to actually run it into a theoretical production environment, and then I could use that virtual hard drive basically creating in this process. So that's one thing you could do. What we're going to do here is create a virtual hard disk now. So this is a brand new instance. This is a brand new operating system. So we'll create a virtual hard disk, and then we'll click this, and then we'll create. Then it says what kind of hard disk file type do you want? VDI, VHD, or VMDK. I would argue just leave it at VDI at this point. If you don't know the difference between these, leave it at VDI. We'll deal with the other ones later. Then you'll go to continue. Then the next thing that's going to be asked is a storage on physical hard disk. Do you want it to be dynamically allocated or fixed size? What this means is if you say fixed size and you give the hard disk, let's say 20 gigs of storage, then it'll automatically allocate 20 gigs of the hard drive to this virtual machine. So whether you have one file on it or you fill up the 20 gigs, all 20 gigs will be used. If you do dynamically allocated, this is pretty cool. What you can do is you can say what the max size you want it to be is. So what you can say is, I want this hard disk to be up to 30 gigs in size, and then it will grow to 30 gigs in size. And so that's a way that you can set how big you want it to grow to, so it won't grow any bigger than that, but until it gets to that point, it won't take up as much space. So if you give it dynamic, you set it to 30, then it takes 5, and then it grows, and then it goes to 6, and then it goes to 7, then go 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So this is something to think about. One of the reasons why you might want to go with fixed size is, let's say you're running multiple virtual machines on this computer, and you want to make sure that they don't all grow and then end up crashing the system, right? So let's say you had, I don't know, a hard drive with 100 gigs of storage space on it. And so you made dynamic hard drives, and you said, let's say you put 3 instances on your system, and you put them all to a dynamic hard drive of up to 50 gigs in size. Well, if you have 3, theoretically the max is 150 gigs, but you don't think you'll actually use 150 gigs. And so they're all slowly growing. Well, what happens if a log file gets turned on or something stupid happens and all your different virtual machines keep growing, and then they grow outside the max amount of space that your host machine has available? Then that could possibly crash the host machine and cause all kinds of problems. So what you might do is you want to say, hey, I don't want to have any surprises in the future, so I will make sure it's all fixed. I know I've got 100 gigs of storage space, so I'll make each one of these virtual machines, I'll give them 33 gigs of fixed allocation, so I know exactly what I'm dealing with. So this is kind of one of those things to be thinking about. In general, if you have a single machine, again, you're doing basic lab tests with Linux or anything else, I would set it to dynamic, but something to be thinking about there. Then we click on continue, and then we say, what size do we want the hard drive? Now again, the important thing is to look at the requirements. Look at the requirements. So again, they default to 10 gigs because back when they were creating these defaults, 10 gigs was huge. Oh my golly, 10 gigs. 10 gigs ain't so big anymore. Ubuntu Desktop actually does a minimum, asks for a minimum of 20 gigs at this point. So again, you can run into problems if you're trying to install the operating system or do something else. If they say the requirement is 20 gigs and you leave it at the default of 10, you can run into issues. So you can simply just type in 30 gigs here, whatever else. You can change this in the future, but I would argue set it to a reasonable number, 30 or 40 gigs. See how that goes, and then you can shrink it later. Then we're going to do create. And okay, so now we have the virtual machine test for class. Now we're going to go and we can take a look at settings, so we can change things here. So we look here, we got general, we have the name, so theoretically we change that here. We have the type, Linux and Ubuntu. We can go to advanced. We can see some other things here, like shared clipboard, something to think about, especially if you're using a desktop operating system within the virtual machine. What this means is, do you want to share between the host machine and the virtual machine? You got a description if you want it, disk encryption theoretically. Then we can go over, take a look at the system. So again, base memory, so we can change that here. We have a boot order. So we have a floppy drive, we have an optical drive, we can have a hard disk, so we can add these or subtract these if we want. Chipset doesn't really matter, pointing device doesn't really matter. Some other information here. We can go take a look at the processor. So we can say how many cores do we want to give over to the virtual machine. I would argue just leave it at 1. And then execution cap. Basically, how much of the CPU do you want the virtual machine to be able to use? And it's set all the way up to 100%. I might be a little careful with this. I may change this. So if you're running into problems, if your virtual machine is using a lot of CPU, I might come here and tweak that. Then we can go over, take a look at display. This is some basic stuff. How much video memory do you want to use? What the monitor count is, that kind of thing. There's some remote display, some recording things here. We won't go into that today, but you may want to, again, depending on how, you're running a desktop operating system within the virtual machine, how much graphics power do you want to give that desktop, that virtual machine? You can change that here. Then we can go to storage. Storage here then gives you your IDE controllers, your virtual IDE controller, and then this is your controller for your SATA. So this is essentially your hard drive. So your test4class.bdi, this is your virtual hard drive. We can go here, we can see the size. So the virtual size is 30 gigs. Since I have it set to dynamic allocation, it's only currently using 2 megs, right? Since I haven't installed an operating system, I haven't done anything yet. It's only using 2 megs out of a theoretical 30 gigs it could use. Location, it says where the location is, attached to blah, blah, blah. You can say whether it's a solid state drive or hot pluggable or other things. I won't worry about that. The one thing that I would take a look at, though, this is what's going to be important for when you install an operating system. Now, I'll show you this when we actually do an operating system installation. But one of the things that you're going to have to do in order to install an operating system into the virtual machine is you're going to have an ISO file. So the ISO file is the disk image file that you use in order to install operating systems. And so what you can do is you can go here, basically, so you go to IDE controller, you go to empty, and then what you can do, you go to choose virtual optical disk file. And what I've done is in downloads, I've downloaded, this is the desktop ISO for Ubuntu 8.04, and this is the server ISO for Ubuntu 18.04. So if I was going to be installing an operating system right now, I would select one of these, I would do open, and so now that ISO file is now connected to that controller. So when I boot, when I turn on this particular virtual machine, it will then boot into that installation routine. So that this is where, if you're sitting there, you're like, how do I actually install the operating system? You have to come here to storage, you go to controller, then you click that little circle thing there, and then go from there. We have audio, so audio, if you want to enable audio, if you want to enable output or input, you can do that here. Then we go to networking. So you can have multiple adapters, especially since you might be dealing with servers, you may want to do something fancy with network adapters. We're not going to do anything too fancy here. The main thing we need to do is we need to enable the network adapter. If this is not enabled, then you don't got a NIC. If you don't got a NIC, you don't got the network. So you have to enable at least one of these network adapters. I would argue enable number 1, so it's easy to find. And then you have attached to, and this is kind of interesting. So you actually have multiple different options here for networking. So what NAT does is basically it allows your virtual machine to simply go out to the internet, go out to the network through your computer with the least amount of problems. You have other options here we may talk about in the future: NAT network, bridged adapter, internal network, host only adapter. And so these are some interesting things that you can do with a networking configuration based off of what kind of lab environment you're trying to create. Basically, are you trying to create a server that can actually be accessed from the internet, from the outside world? Are you trying to create some kind of internal network? Let's say you're going to create some kind of internal lab network where different machines are talking to other machines. There's all kinds of things that you can do. Basically, right now, just leave it at NAT. So if you leave it at NAT, this will allow your virtual machine to go out to the internet. It'll be able to download updates. It'll be able to access the internet through web browsers. It'll be able to do like 99% of the things that you need to do. So at this point in time, I would highly suggest you leave it at NAT. If you go to anything else, like these are other valid options, but they can get confusing. They can cause cause problems. Then past that, we can go to ports, whether you want to enable serial ports. If you have serial ports, or if you want to enable the USB controller, you can do that here. Shared folders, so you can actually share folders between the host operating system and the virtual machine that you're creating. So you can do that there. And then you have this little user interface thing. So you see these little button things here. These will show up at the bottom of the screen when you turn on your virtual machine, and so you can add those or subtract those if you want. So with that, we'll hit OK. All of that gets saved, and then let's say for the test for class, what we can do is we can simply double click that. That will turn that on. We see VirtualBox 6.0, and since I connected that ISO, you can see it's now trying to boot into the installation routine for Ubuntu. You'll see this stuff up here, mouse pointer integration. So the virtual machine reports that the guest OS supports mouse pointer integration. What mouse pointer integration means, this is so nice, is the fact that I can go from here out to the host operating system and back. Look at that. Isn't that cool? I know you're probably thinking like, what the hell? Well, the thing is back in the day, see down here at the bottom, see how it says all the way at the bottom here, it says left, and it has that little whatever clover thing. It used to be where if I moved my mouse into the virtual machine area, it would capture the mouse, and the only way to get my mouse back if I was going to try to interact with the host operating system was to press the left clover. And so what's nice now is that the mouse pointer integration, what this does is it means I can go from the host into the virtual machine and then back out again at will. So that's one of the things that's nice here. I'll just close this. You can see this. When you close, you can save the machine state. So if it's in a state that you like, you could save it. You could send the power down signal if you want, or you just power off and you click OK. And from that, that's really the basics of VirtualBox. You can check for updates and things. You can go to preferences. There are some preferences here. You go to general, so default machine folder. So if you want to change the machine folder where things go, you can change that here. You input, so different shortcuts, different hotkeys. You can do that here. Update, if you want to check for updates. Language, obviously, if you want to do language. Something about the displays. It allows you to deal with displays a little bit. Network. This is for those network options that I was showing you. One of the things you can do is you can create internal networks, and this is the NAT network. We won't deal with that now. There are extensions if you want to deal with those, and proxies. So if you want to send network traffic through proxies, you can set that up here. Most of this here you probably won't mess with until you get more advanced. The only thing that you genuinely may want to change is simply that default machine folder location. If you would just want to basically put all the virtual machines somewhere else, you could change that here. But that's basically what we'll be looking at when we're dealing with VirtualBox and when we're going to be creating instances of Linux operating systems, and we're going to be dealing with them in the lab environment. So that's a brief overview of VirtualBox. We are going to be using this a lot in our Linux labs because, again, it's open source, it's free, it runs on Windows and Linux and Mac and Solaris. If you got Solaris, it does run on that, and it works well. This is one of those products that's been out for a long time. I've been using it for a decade, and I'm not sure when it came out before that, but it's been around for a long time. It's good, easy. Everybody knows how to use it, so we'll be using it for our projects. Do realize, again, with virtualization software, there is other virtualization software out there if you want to use it. Things like products from VMware, that type of thing. We'll just be using this because, again, it's kind of like one of those standard deals. When you're going to be using VirtualBox, there's not too many gotchas. The only really stupid gotcha is that whole how to connect an ISO file. You would think they would make that just a tiny bit easier. But again, you go to storage, and you go to the controller, then you go to that circular thing, then you select the ISO file you want to be able to boot off of in order to install the operating system, and you go from there. That's the only That's the only thing like with VirtualBox. You sit there and go, that's a piss poor design. That is like a shockingly horrible design. Other than that, the important thing to remember is when you're going to be creating your virtual machines is for the hardware resources, don't leave them at the default. Again, a gig of RAM on any kind of Linux operating system with a desktop environment is not going to work. It's just, again, like I say, if you're using GNOME 3 or Unity or anything else, you're going to need at least 2 gigs of RAM. So do make sure, go take a look at the software requirements for whatever operating system you're going to be installing, and then make sure you have that much RAM. The same is true with the hard drive space. Again, 10 gigs of hard drive space 10 years ago was a lot of hard drive space. It's not a lot of hard drive space anymore. So go take a look and decide, how much hard drive space you want to give it. Again, do you want to give it 30 gigs, 40 gigs, or whatever else? The other interesting thing that you may want to play with going into the future is the network configurations. Again, the NAT network, the host adapter, all of those things. Those are very interesting to play with if you want to start, again, messing around with networking, having multiple virtual machines communicate with each other, having the virtual machines be able to communicate with the host machine, having the outside world be able to communicate with the internal virtual machines. That is where you would go and you would change those network configurations. Again, very fun, very interesting, very useful. But if you don't know what the hell you're doing, you're going to break everything and it's not going to work right. So to begin with, just leave it with NAT, and go from there. When you're comfortable with Linux and you're comfortable with the NAT configuration, then you can go and try to futz around with the other things. But it is important to understand, like if you're going to be creating multiple Linux or other virtual machines within the host operating system, and then you want them to be able to communicate with each other, you would go to that network setting and then you would change for what's appropriate. Again, there's a help thing that'll tell you what every single one does. So you would pick the right option and then go from there. So that is also one of those places where you really do need to know what you were trying to accomplish and then pick the right option. And then also realize it can be a little bit quirky. Again, even if you look at the help pages, even if you look at the explanation, there's a whole bunch of asterisks in there. This works on this, but does not work on this, and does not, and like, So just realize once you start messing with that might end up being a little bit more troubleshooting, a bit more playing around than you may be expecting. So anyways, that's really just an overview of VirtualBox. I would say download it, install it, start playing around with it, and then next couple of videos, we're going to start going in and actually installing operating systems and getting into playing with Linux. So with that, as always, I enjoyed doing this video and look forward to seeing you at the next one.